Hello and welcome to the second of our Cane Warriors webinars brought to you by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Beckford's Tower and the State of Trust. I'm your host, Terry Baddoo. Cane Warriors is the book written by Alex Wheatle telling the story of the famous Tacky's Rebellion, a slave uprising that took place in Jamaica, and which is set to become a dance theatre production in March of next year, produced by State of Trust. Today, we focus on historical buildings and their link to the slave trade, and joining us for that is artist, producer, researcher, and former Lord Mayor of Bristol, Cleo Lake, artist, filmmaker, and lecturer, Amanda Egbe, creative media educator, Rob Mitchell, and noted historian, Dr. Amy Frost. Welcome to all of you. Now, let's start with Dr. Amy. How many buildings are we talking about? Where are they? And how are they connected to the slave trade?
We're talking about Bath specifically. We don't know an exact number, but if you take like an average street and look for a particular thing, so I took Lansdowne Crescent, the street that William Beckford, who built Beckford's Tower, lived on, and 6 of the residents in that crescent were paid compensation payments in 1835 following the Compensation Act for the abolition of slavery. So that's like a quarter. So that's a quarter of the street. So if you then thought about the earlier stages of that, the actual construction of these streets and houses, and you looked at the people who are owning the land and where their money came from, the people who are developing the streets and where their money came from, the craftspeople who are borrowing money from provincial banks to build the houses and where the investment of those provincial banks comes from, we're not talking about a quarter of every street. We're talking probably about 3/4 of every street. And when that becomes the entire city, and you know, to really get that data, that's that level of forensic research that needs to be done. But I think it's really safe to say that you know, over half the city absolutely was paid for through the profits of transatlantic slavery, if not the profits of colonialism wider.
That's a pretty large architectural legacy. Do any of the panel feel a little uncomfortable with that in the 21st century? Cleo, perhaps you can start.
Well, I think it is quite staggering, the statistics that Amy just gave us. And I think it is good, though, that we're putting the focus on some of the places around the country that haven't really been in focus, if you like, because, of course, Liverpool, Bristol, we think of the big port cities, but now the attention is going more to the smaller towns, smaller cities, and facing up to this legacy, which, you know, the very bricks and mortar, the fabric of the architecture, the things that attract a world audience, really, we're now kind of seeing it in a different view. But it's how can we sort of translate that reality for the mainstream and help people in some ways to kind of understand this history and the legacy and the importance of it because of the ongoing legacy connected to it, the negative aspects that we endure in society today. So I think as an artist and a producer, that's kind of what I'm interested in, is how do we kind of translate that. But I would also say that language is quite important, and it would be possibly wrong of me to be here and not present other ways of other terminology. So I am just down the road from Bath in Bristol. And we have a lot of connections between the two cities, of course. But we did pass a reparations motion at Bristol City Council just a couple of years ago, 2021, March 2nd. And within that, the City Council themselves agreed on a different language. So rather than saying the slave trade, the preferred terminology now is the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans. And this isn't to say that to correct anyone, because up until maybe 5 or so years ago, I would also say the slave trade. But as things evolve and we learn, it's a journey for all of us. We're all on this journey, no matter what our starting point is. And it's a process of learning and understanding. And I think, just to quickly say why some people have a problem with the words the slave trade, is that it kind of conjures up an equitable relationship. And it doesn't sum up the harm, the inhumanity, the brutality of what actually happened there. And I think someone of Jamaican African descent myself, I could say that as one of those people who's descended from enslavement, we still haven't got to the point of defining the terms on our own terms, if you like. So that's just a bit of a side note, but I thought I should I should start with that as well. Thank you.
I mean, that is a bit of a semantic difference, though, isn't it? How are you going to get that across?
The language.
Mhm.
I think things evolve. I think the fact that the council have adopted it, and if you look through a lot of the work we are doing in museums, that terminology is adopted. Likewise, the World Reimagined, which had a globe arch trail through many of the cities last year, Bristol being one of them, alongside Liverpool, Swansea, Leicester, Leeds, the major cities. They did start off by it was an art project explaining this history, starting with Mother Africa, going through the journey of colonialism, enslavement, and through to the present day. They did start off the project with using the terminology the slave trade, but they actually changed it to not the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, but the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So they shifted it as well. And I think it just takes time. Equally, as a campaigner a few years ago, I was presented from a more of an Afrocentric lens, the word Maangamizi. And to me, I'd never heard of that. It was literally a foreign language to me, but it's something now that I'm very comfortable with saying, that I understand, and that is slowly becoming a little, I wouldn't say mainstream yet, but a little bit more understood. And of course, that is a sort of Kiswahili word. So it is about also reclaiming ourselves, our Africanness, through that and using different terminology. But Terry, it will take time.
Absolutely.
So I was going to add in as well, Terry, I think the use of the word trafficking is very useful in order to be able to present stories of trauma. And linking this conversation with historic buildings and trauma, I think is really important, because that still sits with communities now. It still sits with with Black people in Bristol, in Bath, across the country. You know, I think about walking up the hill in Bristol towards the Willis building, and I think about that building that has such a kind of stature, a physical presence, and what it's attempting to do even today, for people who have this history and have this history of trauma. So I think that's really important, and it's linked to conversations around, you know, what do we talk about when we're talking about these buildings and histories and memories, and those unseen conversations, that trauma of being able to say people who cannot find their history, who don't have this long legacy, isn't memorialized through buildings. That trauma is still there, and we still think about people trying to trace their roots and the impossibility of that because they are unseen in the documentation. Yet that we have this reverence for kind of historic buildings, these buildings that still sit there. That trauma, I think, is really linked to also changing the language and thinking about things like words like trafficking, because it emphasizes that this is still an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I would just jump in to say, well said about language. And I think to answer your point, Terry, about how that change is going to happen, well, there's 100 people on this webinar, for example, who've just heard that for the first time, possibly. So it's piece by piece that knowledge and that change in consciousness will go ahead. On the buildings, I think it's an interesting question about specific buildings. The impact of trafficking, slavery, transatlantic trade, whatever anybody wants to call it, was so pervasive. It goes beyond individual buildings. And if you go down Pulteney Street in Bath, for example, it is like 10 Cornwallis Crescents in Bristol, or the same in you know, or Cornwallis Crescent or Royal York Crescent. Bristol, as Cleo said, was one of the places where the focus has been maintained, and Bath has been off the radar. But Bath, when you walk around Bath, clearly the whole of Bath has had so much more impact from this Georgian expansion. They call it a Georgian city for that reason. And I think it's almost impossible. It's like trying to separate drops from the ocean because the impact was so huge. There was a project that I was involved with Sean Sober's Firstborn and National Trust, called Reinterpretation. And at the time, the National Trust were looking at Clevedon Court, Durham Park, and somewhere else. If I remember, I'll say. But some of the places like Cleveland Court, where the family were very much involved in trafficking, is really obvious. And people look, say, were they involved? One of the things when members of the National Trust had to go around places and say, is it okay to celebrate this place still? Because were they people involved in slavery? Whereas with Durham Park, it was less obvious. And the connections to African enslavement was seen by these two torchieres, these like little ornament things that were clearly figures of Africans, which were held and preserved by the fireplace, and that was meant to be the thing. But the thing that at the time wasn't really picked up, but it has been now by the National Trust in their reinterpretation again, is the fact that Blathwaite, who led the development of that property, was in charge of the whole colonial project. So he seems like a civil servant because he didn't own any ships or didn't whip any Africans. It was like, well, there's no connection there. But in reality, he was overseeing the whole project. So actually, I think it's really impossible to separate individual buildings. We do have clues around compensation, we have clues around this and that, but in reality, the point is this thing impacted the whole of Britain and Europe.
It's interesting you say about celebrating the buildings. Should they be celebrated or are they an embarrassment? And if they're to be celebrated, Amy, how do you go about doing that as far as Beckford's Tower is concerned?
We certainly don't see the tower in the museum as a celebration of William Beckford himself. He is not a person that deserves celebrating on lots of different aspects. I think there's something about the buildings, the actual structures, the kind of material heritage that we can talk about the skill of the makers, we can talk about the importance of the designers, we can talk about the significance of that particular building or that place and the contribution it makes. But I don't think we can ever really, we can't ever separate that from the source of the money that paid for it, the culture within which it was created or established, and the kind of legacy that particular styles of architecture have. I mean, like Rob said, it's the entire city, but it's also when you combine the architecture that's always talked about in any book on the Georgian period of architecture, and Bath being heralded as one of the key places in terms of development, this style of architecture that is then the style that is taken and forcibly imposed on other places. This kind of, this imperialist style, this language of architecture that's about power, that's about control, is then forced on other places and becomes the style of that place, to the removal or the destruction of the vernacular inherent culture and style of the architecture of that place. So it is that kind of, you start with one building and then it's a street and then it's a city and then it's the entire nation's style of architecture.
Do these buildings have protected status? And if they do they warrant it given their history?
Yeah, listing and designated status is a really interesting discussion, actually, because yes, I mean, most of Bath is listed, so designated as a heritage asset, and you designate things, or you place a heritage value on things for its age, its material, the maker, the significance it had, but that idea of significance, when we talk about built heritage, is a really useful term. It's a term because that significance could be not physical, it could be intangible, it could be it's the property on Terrace Walk here in Bath that was used to be a place that you sort of effectively fair trade goods and cotton as a kind of abolitionist movement, I think it's Hannah Sturge was setting it up to use cloth and cotton that had not been gained through the trafficking and the trade that we're talking about. So that kind of, you know, that's not about the physicality of the building, that's about actually the people or the events that took place there. And that's where there is a gap. There is a gap in the kind of designation of buildings or the acknowledgement of their significance in terms of it being the global histories of those buildings and it not just being seen through a particular lens.
I mean, I would say, and thank you all for bringing up Sean Sober's work, because I think that's an example of kind of really working with kind of historic buildings to find spaces in which kind of audiences and artists can begin to raise these questions about what is it that we're memorializing here? What's whose history and what questions of history are we talking about? And I think there's a reason why there's a conversation with kind of artists and performers, because I think there's a way in which some of those other questions of memory and history that are unseen if we only see history as a question of power, we only see it of, you know, the so-called great figures. There's other ways in actually that we can talk about history, what those mean, and raising those up to another level. So I think there is work in which we can talk about what Black lives look like and how they are in those spaces. But I think we can, you know, there is increasing acknowledgement of the way in which, you know, there are a number of Black artists. I can think about, you know, at the moment in Moving Image, Isaac Julian, John Okomfra, who've all looked at ways in which you work with archives, work with museums, to start to talk about this different way in which we memorialize, we talk about Black experiences. And those are, and, you know, Black people being in those spaces and feeling that they have a right to those spaces is one act of kind of making a difference. But I also think, and what's really kind of beautiful in the conversations about the dance performance at Beckford Tower and the choreography there, is that there are these embodied experiences around how the trauma of you know, kind of transatlantic trafficking is there. We can talk about the experiences of saying whose city, whose space, whose power, what were these buildings built upon? And if they're built upon the kind of bodies of Black people, then there's another way of perhaps representing that within the history. So I think projects that are exploring those conversations are really important and are actually this kind of body of work that comes out of the Black experience and Black history and Black performance as well.
Well, I think there is a paradox that so much art comes out of trauma. Cane Warriors itself, Alex's work, has come out of his own trauma. To go back to buildings a second, Amanda mentioned Will's Memorial, my alma mater. I enjoyed my time at Bristol. I'm proud of Bristol University. Will's tobacco-funded building is indeed the centerpiece of the place. Very imposing building at the top of Park Street, which dominates the landscape and is trying to make an impact and does make an impact. Similarly, I think Beckford Tower, not just Beckford Tower, but take pretty much so much stuff. And Madge Dresser, Dr. Madge Dresser, did a book, Slavery in the English Country House, which looked at a number of buildings across the country which were connected to slavery. The implication, the implicit fact of why we go to these places, why they are preserved culturally, etc., is a celebration. And I don't think we necessarily have to say, let's get rid of them or change the name of them and all this, which the University of Bristol are trying to do right now as well, around some of its, a few of its buildings. I think it is a celebration. Let's acknowledge it is a celebration, because I don't think you can go into some places like Beckford Tower, these grand country houses, and can't be awestruck by the grandeur of the design and stuff like that. We went to those houses when we do the reinterpretation project with members of Bath Ethnic Minority Senior Citizens Association, BEMSCA, and without any detail, facts or stats, the underlying assumption by us as people largely from Caribbean backgrounds at different kind of generations was, of course this was built on slavery. That was just the assumption. We had that. So one of the blessings, if you like, of 2020 trauma, the benefits of trauma again, was that, well, there was lots of 2020, but specifically around George Floyd and the Colson statue, was that I think the world had turned the corner in terms of its understanding of the connection between modern day brutalities and past brutalities. And as Amanda said about Black bodies, Black lives, etc. I don't think these things are exclusive to Black people, by the way. I think we're the most obvious and one of the most recent and large scale who've seen such trauma. But power, Amanda mentioned that again, the way power, the way capitalism, the way exploitation, the way profiteering works, it means that people will be exploited. I think you can go around the world today and probably see some terrible examples of abuse of people's lives. But I think the reason we hold on to this story, partly in this country as people of African descent, is one, I think this story is quite recent, even the last 400 years is recent. And also it's very live. So either you're being brutalized by the police force or you're being told, go back to where you came from, you don't belong here. And those are the kind of core ideas, I think, of why we've still got these axes to grind. But I don't think one can be not awestruck by some of the things that come out of the trauma. Like I said to begin with, art is often sort of fueled by trauma of some sort, either personal or institutional.
Yeah, let me ask you, when you were Lord Mayor, you campaigned to remove portraits of enslavers. Am I correct in that? So if that's true, then is there an argument to be made for these buildings not existing any longer?
I should say it wasn't a campaign because there was no resistance to me asking for the portraits to be removed, which was very good of Bristol City Council. No, I don't believe that they should be decimated and that they shouldn't exist. I certainly believe in it's how we engage with them today, how we reanimate them, how we tell the full story, how we do our best to make different communities feel comfortable with taking up space in these buildings. For example, you did mention my term as Lord Mayor. There is a fairly dilapidated now mansion house that goes alongside the role of Lord Mayor. It's not the original one because that got burnt down in the 1831 riots, but it's been there for some time. It is quite a grand house, needs investment, but it's quite a grand house, and it tended to attract certain types of people who'd visit it on an open doors day. So through my term, I really worked to bring as many people from my community with me to certain events and to open up the house and to invite people along. People did enjoy their time there. There are some parts of it that were problematic, but it does have nice gardens, for example. I think when we think about space, yeah, we can think about the architecture in the building, but we can also think about what surrounds that. So I'm probably more now thinking of, say, National Trust properties and access to that, and how many people, know about these spaces and can go and enjoy them. So I'm very much for reinterpretation and telling the full story without trying to trigger trauma, which is obviously a fine line to tread. Amanda talked about dance, and obviously Cane Warriors is a dance project, and it did make me think of a project I was involved in recently, which was called Decolonizing Memory, Digital Bodies in Movement, and that was a project sort of led in part by Bristol University, UKRI funded, and the purpose of that, it was a citizen science project, if you like. So he engaged, anyone was able to get involved with it. The purpose was actually to go to some of these buildings, some of these sites, some of these places in colonial history in Bristol, and how does it feel when we're there? What's coming out in the body? How can we reinterpret that through movement in a kind of anything went sort of way, and working with people, because I think we should also think about what is the end goal that we're trying to achieve if we are trying to achieve anything. For us in that project, we were trying to achieve a sense of healing So we knew in the immediate term, just moving our bodies, just thinking about this and getting some of this out of our bodies was a way that we could try to immediately, in part, heal ourselves. But beyond that, teaching the dance, which we went on to make a kind of folk dance, a modern folk dance, looking at the history, looking at Caribbean history, influenced by some of the architecture in Bristol, some of the obvious history, but also modern things like the toppling of the statues. So we brought it right up to date with a view of sharing it as far as we could. So those are some of the things that I think are really important, and it's what is our purpose now? Because there's obviously reconciliation that needs to happen. This is a very live topic, and we're seeing some people embracing it, no matter how difficult it is, and some people, the tagline of the culture wars. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But yeah, I'm not for dismantling, really.
Well, I would say it always depends, right? I think where you are, what the struggles are in that particular location is part of how that conversation plays out. I think in certain circumstances where there is a recognition, there is no struggle in that sense. So, Cleo's talking about, it wasn't a resistance to remove those portraits because there's already a set of understandings, and that understanding doesn't disappear. It's in the minutes of a given meeting. There's no attempt to obscure history. And I think these are conversations about what type of histories do we want and who controls those narratives. And where we have open discussions, where we have people engaged in all levels of that knowledge making, and then I think that's a space in which these decisions play out openly, democratically, and not a question of power, where it's somebody saying, no, it will be like this, that we're dominating. And, coming back, yes, to buildings, coming back to spaces, it's a question of, those spaces being used to dominate. And in those circumstances, sometimes the answer is to pull down. Sometimes these are not really questions that time moves on. And there are different things that we may celebrate. And I think very much these conversations around, the types of buildings that we're seeing are problematic are also opportunities for us to discuss what type of histories do we want to live by. And I think that's the next set of the conversations, is that we don't have to say there's only one way to do history. There's only one way to memorialize something. There's only one way to think or to know things. And I think we're in a moment in time where we can start to talk about the different strategies and approaches that you can have in a landscape that opens up a history to many. And the struggle around kind of the transatlantic trafficking conversation, I think, as Rob was saying, is not just a question for Black communities. It's a question about how we open up histories to all. And it is that intersectional conversation about race, about gender, about class, about sexuality. Who is it who's saying there's only one version of history that we can have? And that's a problem. I think when we can come together, ally together, struggle together for a history that's for all of us, I think that makes a different space. And so, we're all engaging in these conversations about how we can open that up, how we can open up these histories with their trauma to different ways of having a notion of memory, of having space, and of living with that.
It's very much about liveness and, quite right, context and who's living and who in that space and who's working with that space and who's having to deal with that space every day. The University of Bristol, mentioned earlier, are going through a review of a few buildings, 3 or 4 buildings with names which have connections to slavery. And there has been a consultation with the student body, the faculty, staff, and there was a survey with an overwhelming sort of decision to go towards renaming. As part of that wider conversation, or part of a need to widen the conversation, the university also, Marianique and Alvin, 2 people from the university, supported by the university top brass, also held a consultation event in Rose Green Centre in Bristol, which is home to Bristol West Indian Cricket Ground. And the organisers also went out their way to actually make sure that people, especially from African Caribbean communities, were at that event. And it was a well-attended event, and there was lots of conversation about buildings, etc. And the interesting thing that came out of that was the opposite decision: do not rename the buildings, right? And that was coming from the Black communities, guys. I'm sure that if the Daily Mail or the Sun or whatever the mainstream narratives were picked up and they'd say, oh, those wet liberals, those Black people that can't want to change the history, whatever. But actually, it turned out that the people of African descent did not see that as the most important thing. One, because it disconnects the building from its history and therefore removes any contribution that was made by our ancestors. And two, they're more pressing now concerns, economic and social, that people thought were more important to work with. So it turns out that the pressure to rename the buildings in that context were coming from within the university. Certainly the university is more diverse these days than when I was there, but certainly a large part of them are very young and quite rightly activist minded and want to change things, which is great, which is what you're supposed to be doing at that age. So I thought that was a really interesting, that it was the absolute opposite decision about renaming. So I think it's the same with Terry, the question about getting rid of and should we celebrate? I think why not celebrate? I mean, architecture is architecture, isn't it? The fact it was paid for by excessive wealth founded by inequitable trade has also to be acknowledged. That without that excessive wealth, you wouldn't have that amazing architecture in all of the contexts and examples around the country. So that's why I think even things like, trying to diversify people who goes to those places, I think that's all part of it. It's like saying, well, this belongs to you. So when you say, as we would have done growing up, go back to your own country, it's like, well, this is my country. My ancestors built this country. I have a stake in this thing. And I think that's probably the more important social aspect of all of these things, rather than kind of getting rid of them. It's more about acknowledging the provenance of them and incorporate that into the story. So it's not about necessarily making people feel guilty when they go into those places. It's about making the story fuller.
I want to add one thing to that, though. I want to say one of the problems we do have about history is the fact that when we're told something looks good, it's told to us that it looks good because of power. And I think that's the other part of the conversation, is being able to celebrate what it looks like in terms of other cultures, talking about what it is in terms of the affirmation of Black culture and how it has helped change Bristol, change Bath. I think it also requires that level of celebration. And sometimes that celebration is a dance, and sometimes that celebration is a building. There's a moment in which you go, we need to raise up our communities as well, because those are things to be cherished, those are important things, and our histories need to be able to do both. And they should be able to do both because history shouldn't be terrorizing. And I still have this conversation about thinking about certain memorials are terrorizing. Certain memorials are terrorizing or problematic. And like we can think about of problematic texts, some of them can fall away. There are thousands of monuments, there are thousands of buildings. And having those conversations within communities is to say, is it really relevant? And why, I think is the beauty of saying, well, living memorials. It means so much to be able to continue those histories on. And when history is done well, I think, in terms of historic monuments and buildings, it's because those are spaces in which all of those histories can kind of exist together in terms of those problems, in terms of who they are elevating. And we still have so much to learn about how we do that. The conversation isn't closed as to how we make history, how we memorialize, how we understand that. And that's why I think, kind of this series of conversations is so important, because there are so many approaches that haven't even been considered, haven't been thought of, haven't been embodied in so many ways. And I think that's the other set of things we're trying, it's so important to have these conversations about, to also elevate and to be able to give a space over to those conversations is so important.
But how does somewhere like Beckford's Tower and other of these historic buildings, how do they address some people's discomfort about their past? Amy?
It's an interesting question. I think, we've talked quite a bit about power and control, and I think, from a museum, the museum and the curator, there is a power dynamic with your visitors, and that kind of assumption that the museum voice, the curatorial voice, is the one that is telling you what is good and what isn't, what is a great piece of architecture, what isn't, what is a, and so we have to give up some of that control. We have to give up that power. We have to allow other voices to have the agency to kind of to take some of that control and power, and that's through, particularly for museums, that's exploring the things we've talked about, like creative practice through artistic responses, so that you're not getting the everything that's on the label is the absolute hard and fast truth or the only thing you should know about. And we all know it's absolutely impossible to actually talk about every single facet of one tiny object in a 45-word label. So the layers of story and the storytellers and who we engage with to tell those stories, and therefore who gets the power to come into the spaces and buildings and see those objects, has to be absolutely the forefront of what we think about, and giving over, and for a curator to say that is often the one thing you kind of really struggle with, but actually we have to give over power and we have to give over control. And I've been in something called Day to Day, and several people said, the origin of the word curate or curator is to care, and we see that as we care for our objects that we are custodians of, we care for our buildings that we're custodians of, but we care for our communities and we care for our people and we care for every person that encounters those things, and that means we have to give them control and let people take that power when they come to places and spaces, and interpret them for themselves. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, things will be uncomfortable. I think we are in quite an uncomfortable time for many people who are sort of having to face the reality of, for some people, what their ancestry and their families were involved with, and how it connects to several issues that we have today. I just wanted to highlight a project at the Georgian House in Bristol. There is an installation at the moment, which is Voices of Georgian House, and I will probably share the link in the chat in a minute. But in fact, one of the artists, Cleo Lake, she has, rather than, again, thinking of Amy saying about the labels, and sometimes that can be off-putting. Yeah, we want to know the history and the facts, but it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes going through, and the pokiness of going through a Georgian house. It can be quite tight in some ways, and obviously how you navigate the space, which is, going back to the previous question, something also important and something that you touched on early on, Amy. It's how you walk around these spaces and the essence of power. So I would also add how we can modernize when we think about reconstructing these spaces, having the old, but also having the new, and making them literally accessible, because some of these spaces are very inaccessible, particularly if you have mobility needs, etc. But just to go back to the Georgian house, the artist who's part of the reinterpretation there, and I was involved also, and it was the idea of, let's present poetry. let's present the facts, but in a poetic form. Let's try to communicate with audiences in another way, because sometimes it's felt like this is the set way we do things in the museums, and this is how it's going to be. But I am pleased now to see that there's this kind of collaborative journey of how we can tell stories in a different way. Akula's installation is actually based on, and the Georgian house was owned by a plantation owner in Nevis, a former mayor of Bristol as well. And one of the known people of African heritage in the city in those Georgian times is commemorated to an extent in the city, Pero, who was his personal servant. So that history is in the house. And Akula's actually decided to base her work on, and it's an audio as well as a visual representation, on the Ten Commandments. So it's very challenging. It's thinking about religion, it's thinking about the role of the church, it's right in your face, but it's also giving the voice of a woman who we know was actually wasn't enslaved, was, if you like, freed by this plantation owner, but she was in the house. It's talking about her journey, and she was quite a religious woman. So it is having these other voices. Likewise, there's been a lot of research over the years. So if you go to the top of the Georgian house, which is a museum, a public museum that anyone can visit, you will see almost 900 names of people who would have been enslaved by the owner of the house. So, and some of the names are could be located to what we would see as modern day Ghana. So for us as well, we wanted to kind of animate those voices, give them a voice, think about them as individuals, and bring a sense of their culture, their identity in the space, and move away from the idea of slave as identity, really. So yeah, those are some of the things that are happening. And also, I think in terms of curating, sometimes we can go into spaces, and I think we can't dictate or we can't determine, depending on your background, who might be interested in what. As you heard from Rob, in terms of the consultation, there are a lot of people of African Caribbean heritage who didn't agree with renaming, for example. Likewise, you'll get a lot of people from the community who quite like to visit some of the stately homes or have events there. And I do agree with what was said earlier, if your ancestors' lives in many ways paid for these places, then you should take up space. You should be there. But I think, again, visiting some of these spaces, if you're coming from a particular background, you will see things. I see things in a different way. I might see something that speaks to me that may have been not even catalogued, not even referenced. As an artist said to me once, they'll tell you more about what paint it was, this, that, and the other, the materials, and less about the subject matter. So again, I'm thinking of another museum we have in Bristol, the Red Lodge, and one of the oldest portraits of an African heritage person who's likely to be who is a child, and who is that history of early 17th century children being enslaved to come over as playmates for elite families, and then you kind of think about what happened to that person after. So that portrait exists in the house, and now there is more information about that on the website. But of course, some people would walk around and maybe wouldn't notice it as much. But coming from my heritage, that's one of the first things I do notice. So it's kind of like what we pick out, what we draw on, what we get more information about, and how we just make it more accessible. Because I think people would be are interested. But again, many people of different backgrounds have never visited. They may have lived in Bristol their whole lives and have never visited. Likewise, in Bath, maybe there are people who've never heard of Beckford's Tower. So it's how do we let people know that this is for everyone? And then for it being for everyone, how do we include more people, and how do we make it physically and otherwise more accessible?
How do you see the Cane Warriors production as relevant to getting the history, the story of these buildings out there? Rob?
Well, the Cane Warriors production, script stroke production, book stroke production story, takes a part of the history which is completely untold. I also work for Black Families Education Support Group, and we did a great project with Amy and Beckford Tower, or Lansdowne Tower, as proposed by one of the people in the Q&A I see here. And Cane Warriors is trying to do two things: talk to young people and to flip the script so that rather than seeing victimized, objectified slaves, the Cane Warriors are a group of activists with agency. There's a lot of violence in the text, obviously, because the conditions are very violent, and it's trying to flip the script. One of the things that this whole exercise does, these conversations do, is get us to flip the narrative, because as everyone's mentioned before, power is really important. There is no single truth, there is no single narrative. And you can see what you made me that I'm wearing a Fairfield House jumper at the moment, which is celebrating the story of Haile Selassie. I've just come back from a wonderful trip in Ethiopia with Sean Sobers, and one of the things that he mentioned before, that after Colston came down in 2020, a statue of Haile Selassie was vandalized by people of the Roma group who have issues with the national narrative in Ethiopia. For example, that's not a black and white story. That's about power and narrative. Also, quickly to pick up on one of the other Q&A points by Kirsty, your typo is excused. I don't even see the typo, but your typo is excused. Women, for example, when we reinterpreting these things, one of the things it does, it kind of makes us recognize there is no one narrative, and power is what determines what truth is, whether it's religion or national history. Power is what determines what truth is. And as Kirsty mentions in the Q&A, women are absent in most of these historical narratives. And that's really, really evident. My last trip to Durham Park, they're doing a great job of reinterpreting the place. It became really apparent that the women in that world, one, was responsible for the great wealth that the Mr. Blathwaite is being credited with, and two, are completely absent. So one would hope, and I think there's also mentions as well about Irish labourers in the Q&A and class and those things. And of course, it's much harder to find individual stories in that because they're lost. Who's documenting? Can these people write? Who cares? So the people with the pens. In fact, in Ethiopia, there's a whole in Menelik's Palace, which is also being renamed. There's a thing called the Department of the Pen or something like that, the National Archives. So who has the pen? Who has the power? And what Alex is doing is trying to refocus the lens, if you like.
Let me go to a Q&A. You mentioned Q&A there. I've got one here. Do figures like William Beckford have power in history? If so, does the truthful representation of his links to transatlantic trafficking of African people undermine that power? Anybody like to grab that one?
Yeah, I can start on William Beckford in particular. Yeah, I think he does. You know, he's been seen, you know, as he's been presented through biographies, you know, through the way that a lot of these stories are told, to hold like a certain position and therefore a certain value. And you know, I even myself, you know, I've been looking after for the tower for 20 years, and for a good, you know, first 5-6 years of those, you know, he could do no wrong in my eyes. And that you know, that was the research that I'd done and the books that I'd read. And then the more you read, the more you understand, actually the more you confront your own lack of education or knowledge about certain stories, or your own privilege, you know, the more you start to rethink that. And you know, he has been given power, you know, for things that he is significant in as a writer, as designer, certain aspects of his story. But he had power that he used and abused, and that story, the more we can tell the story, the more the story is understood about the money that gave him that power, and his abuse of that power, the less power he will have today in terms of our story. And that's what we're really trying to do or negotiate or in the museum. It is, you know, talking about the things that you can be in awe of, like Rob said, you know, objects that are the absolute pinnacle of craftsmanship and creative skill at the time, but always say about the money that paid for it. So I think we can change the power dynamic. I think we can move him further down and move other Beckfords, other people with the surname Beckford, can have some of that power in the stories. And it's interesting that that point Rob said about women. Some of the research around Taki, around the Cane Warriors story and around the Taki's rebellion and that war, those freedom fighters, the first kind of group of people who were effectively arrested during that revolt. We have records of them because they were arrested and imprisoned on a ship. So there are records on the ship's logs, and half of them were women. So there's this really interesting story about the Taki's war and the uprising and these the enslaved people who were freedom fighting, and half of them, we have the evidence, were women. And those stories that kind of aren't told. So I think yeah, William Beckford has power in history, but we're actually trying to kind of dilute it in the projects that we're doing and in the work we're doing, and these evenings like this evening are actually doing.
Can I add as well, Shoda, one of the things I've been involved in terms of archiving in museums is really opening up that entire process to the community. So, and that goes to doing metadata, doing the cataloging, doing the scanning and archiving. Because one of that question about taking power, or the question who's seen or not seen, if you go into an archive and you say, I want to look for the history of this or this thing, and it was I think a colleague of mine, Dr. Isabel Higgins, who's working in Cambridge at the moment, looking at the Library of Congress archive, just trying to search for something can be really problematic, because the people who were involved in putting those tags on or cataloging something also come with all of those kind of prejudices or ideas that history is that of the victors. And so, this conversation about opening up museums and archives to a sense of expertise that lives in the community as well is, I think, really important. That history, while me, Rob, Cleo, and particularly you, Amy, are like experts in some ways, everybody has an expertise. And I think that knowledge and history and being able to say, I understand history because I'm also saying what I see is important, and that should be part of the conversation. And I think that takes away the power, because instead of searching for Beckford in a search, or William Beckford, you're starting to search for these other names if they're listed there. There are so many kind of questions that permeate our notion of how we make history and who does it, that really can be shifted towards a much more plural idea of what is important to us, and that shifts the conversation. Again, it shifts the conversation about, do we need to knock down a building? Do we need to? Some of that will disappear once more people are able to be part of that conversation in talking about how we catalog history, what gets cataloged, how we tag it, how we name it, what's important in terms of our understanding of a given object or a given moment, or the look of some building. I think that becomes really important. So I'm hoping that along with kind of bringing artists in, there's also a sense of starting to get more people in the community to become archivists, whether that's done as a citizen archivist, as spare time, or actually, studying it, becoming archivists, taking roles of curators in museums, in galleries, repositories, and collections.
Just time for one more Q&A question. What do you hope the legacy of the Cane Warriors project will be, both the book and the production? Rob, would you like to?
Rob start.
Go, Amy.
Yeah.
Well, for the tower, there's like an immediate legacy in that embedded into the museum when it reopens in March next year will be clips from the research and development of the dance performance. A copy of the book is in a display case, talking about the story it tells, but that's just the start. I think, and you know, that's the start, and I think for us, it's also goes back to what we sort of started with about space and place, and how the performance in that space can change the space, and change how people see it, and who will come, and that, you know, it's the first project like this that we've done, and it absolutely won't be the last. And you know, if we can, you know, like Amanda was saying, like if we can actually have the opportunity for people to do some of that research, to actually be undertaking the research, the cataloguing, and really importantly, the kind of equitable dissemination of that research, then, you know, we can name some of those cane warriors, and they become the people that we talk about in the museum, in the guidebook, in the interpretation. It's their stories that people walk away from visiting the museum talking about. You know, there's this guy that built this building, and the building's great, but these are the stories that I found when I came here. So that's the kind of legacy you know, we're certainly hoping for.
Well, that sums it up nicely, and you're spot on time. What a professional. So thanks to everyone, Amy, Amanda, Cleo, and Rob. And you can comment on the webinar in our survey using the upcoming QR code. Our third and final Cane Warriors webinar is in 4 weeks' time on October 25th. Until then, I'm Terry Baddoo. Bye for now.